At 8:40 that night, an armed man moved toward a Secret Service checkpoint inside the Washington Hilton. He was carrying a shotgun, a handgun, and several knives. He had booked a room in the very same hotel where, just a few yards away, the President of the United States was having dinner, surrounded by journalists, cabinet officials, and federal agents. He was not outside. He was not trying to get in. He was already inside. That detail changed the nature of the threat entirely. Not because Donald Trump had once again become a target, by then that was no longer unusual, but because for the third time in less than 2 years, someone had managed to get close enough. And when that happens, the question stops being who wants to kill the president. The question becomes something far more uncomfortable. How do they keep getting this close? For the White House, this was the third major assassination attempt against Trump in less than 2 years. Not at a rally, not on a road, not behind a barricade, inside the same building. That is the idea holding this entire story together. Not the weapon, not the attacker, not the motive, access. Because what connects this sequence is not the profile of the men who tried to get close to Trump, but the fact that in 3 different settings, all of them managed to reduce the distance. A campaign rally, a private residence, a fortified hotel, 3 different environments, 3 different levels of security, and yet the same outcome. Someone got too close. The United States knows political violence. It has known it since Dallas, since the shot that killed John F. Kennedy in 1963. It has known it since Memphis, where Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. It has known it since Washington, where Ronald Reagan survived an assassination attempt in 1981. And it has known it in its contemporary form as well. The attack on Republican lawmakers in 2017, the plot to kidnap Governor Gretchen Whitmer, the assault on the Capitol, and the attack on Paul Pelosi. Political violence is not new in the United States. What is new is its frequency. What has changed is the speed at which it has stopped feeling exceptional. That is the context in which this story must be understood. Not as a string of isolated incidents, but as the visible expression of a threat that has stopped being sporadic and become recurrent. The first episode happened in Butler, Pennsylvania. Trump was still a candidate, and the event followed the familiar rhythm of a campaign stop. An open stage, a crowd gathered in front of a platform, and a security apparatus designed to contain threats in a highly exposed environment. Events like these have always represented a paradox for the Secret Service. They are built to bring a candidate physically closer to the electorate, but also to expose him. In settings like that, the agency's job is not to eliminate risk, but to reduce it. Control access, screen attendees, secure elevations, watch sightlines, detect the improbable before it becomes a threat. Then the shot rang out. The bullet grazed Trump's ear. The attack left people wounded and turned a campaign rally into a live broadcast crisis scene. Within seconds, Secret Service agents covered the candidate and rushed him off the stage while the cameras kept rolling. The event ended there. The threat did not. Butler changed something more important than the campaign schedule. It changed the meaning of his protection. Up to that point, Trump's security had been a high-risk operation. After Butler, it became a persistent threat operation. And that distinction matters. A high-risk threat demands reinforced protection. A persistent threat forces the assumption that this was not an isolated event. It forces the assumption that they will try again. The second episode happened at Mar-a-Lago, and it changed a different assumption. It did not happen in front of cameras, did not happen at a public event. It happened at the perimeter of a private residence, and that changed the entire reading of the risk. Mar-a-Lago does not function like a house in the conventional sense. It functions like a protected zone, controlled access, constant surveillance, private security, agency coordination, and multiple layers of containment designed to stop threats before they cross the line. That is why, when an armed man managed to breach the perimeter and trigger an emergency response, the most disturbing detail was not merely the profile of the intruder, it was the access. Butler could be explained as exposure. A candidate on the campaign trail is exposed by definition. Mar-a-Lago is not. Mar-a-Lago does not represent exposure, it represents containment. And that is why the episode changed the conversation more deeply. After Butler, the question was how to better protect Trump. when he was out in public. After Mar-a-Lago, the question changed. How safe was he even when he was not? And that is a much harder question to answer because it no longer points to the attacker. It points to the system. The third episode was the most delicate and, at the same time, the hardest to justify institutionally. It happened at the Washington Hilton during the White House Correspondents' Dinner, one of the most concentrated nights of political, media, and operational power in the American calendar. In a single building were the president, cabinet members, federal agents, national and international press, and multiple overlapping layers of security. Events like this are not protected like ordinary public appearances. They are protected like continuity of government operations. That means the objective is not only to protect one person, but to protect a chain of command. In theory, it is one of the most controlled environments in the country. And yet, according to court documents and reporting from Reuters and the Washington Post, 31-year-old Cole Thomas Allen booked a room in the same hotel. He entered as a guest. He stayed inside the building. And at around 8:40 that night, he moved armed toward a Secret Service checkpoint. That is what makes this episode different. He was not trying to get in. He was already in. He was carrying a shotgun, a handgun, and knives. According to the federal complaint, he opened fire on agents at the checkpoint. One Secret Service officer was struck in the chest and survived because of his ballistic vest. Trump was evacuated. Protocols were activated within seconds. Guests took cover. Agents sealed internal access points. The attacker was subdued before reaching the main ballroom. The attack did not reach the president, but it did reach something more sensitive, the perception of control. Because presidential security does not depend only on physical protection. It also depends on an idea. The idea that certain perimeters, by definition, do not fail. And that night, that idea broke. Not because the attacker reached Trump, but because he proved he could get closer than the system was willing to admit. Seen separately, the three episodes appear different. Butler was a campaign event. Mar-a-Lago was a private perimeter. Washington was a fortified event. 3 different settings, 3 different levels of security, 3 different attackers, but the same conclusion. Access, that is the pattern. Butler exposed the vulnerability of open space. Mar-a-Lago exposed the fragility of the private perimeter. Washington exposed the vulnerability of the supposedly hardened environment. These were not 3 identical repetitions. They were 3 versions of the same problem. And that is where this story stops being only about Donald Trump. Because the problem is not only Trump. Trump is the visible target. The real problem is what this sequence reveals about the United States, what it reveals about the capacity for radicalization, what it reveals about the deterioration of political language, what it reveals about how quickly a democracy can grow accustomed to the idea that violence is no longer an anomaly, but a recurring possibility. After the third episode, the conversation in Washington stopped focusing only on the president. It shifted towards something broader: presidential security, domestic radicalization, and political violence as a persistent threat. Analysts and officials cited by American media converged on one central concern. The repetition of these episodes does not only expose security failures, it exposes a deeper political deterioration. The Secret Service can reinforce access points. It can harden filters. It can redesign protocols. It can armor routes and strengthen perimeters. What it cannot do is correct the climate that produces these threats. It cannot de-radicalize a country. It cannot cool a political culture that has turned opponents into enemies. It cannot contain, with physical barriers, a public language increasingly willing to justify the unthinkable. That is the limit, and it is also the real problem. Because this story is not only about security, it is about deterioration, about what happens when hostility stops being rhetorical and starts looking for form, about what happens when a country stops asking whether something can happen and starts asking when it will happen again. Butler left a warning. Mar-a-Lago left an alarm. Washington left something worse, the sense that next time it may not have to begin from outside. And perhaps that is the hardest part to ignore. Not that 3 different men tried to get close to the same target, but that each time they needed less distance.